Good evening. Welcome to week 4 of Mpai 600 here at Georgetown University School of Continuing Studies. Start off with announcements. The one thing I want you to do is start thinking about your papers. I'm going to go ahead and release the papers right now, and they will have a lot to do with what we saw in week 3 and week 4. So go ahead, start having that in the back of your head as you're continuing with this week's reading and as you're reflecting on the past week's reading as well. I do want to comment on what's going on. Obviously, the current events is what's happening, the protests. I will wait till a further week. I want to make sure the news, we can distill from what's happening from the news and get a little bit more detail going forward. And I'll talk about that more in depth next week. And I have a lot to discuss in this YouTube, so I don't want to crowd that out. So we'll get into that detail in next week's YouTube. So paper one overview, most of you have it back. I apologize. There's about half dozen of you who do not have it back. You should have that back early next week. But for what I've seen so far, and I thought it was pretty good. Most people satisfied the requirements for the assignment. Just a couple of issues. As always, requirements way too broad. Sometimes I get requirements like this. This could be narrowed down. Does ISIS use Telegram to attract people at this age? This is kind of a requirement that you can actually plan off of. The first one is just way too broad. So kind of similar ones over and over again. So do the work beforehand. Do the analysis beforehand before you push the collection asset out. And that'd be just a key point going forward. Policy versus intel requirements. Try and make them, again, the requirement should be threat-centric. So not will UAVs detect Sonoro drug cartel smuggling over the El Paso border. Ask what is the characteristic of smuggling over the El Paso border by Sonoro drug cartel mules. That is much more specific, and you don't lead with already pushing your imagery asset or whatever asset out front. You want to ask the question that's relevant. You don't want to ask the question that's answerable. I just want to make sure that's clear at the onset. And then social media exploitation. Some of you did do this, and that's good. We didn't talk about OSINT in this course, and maybe we should. Maybe we should have a section on OSINT in a future iteration, and you'll have an OSINT class in the future. But social media exploitation does work sometimes, and it sometimes doesn't work. It works if you're trying to examine Russian influence in Eastern Europe. That's fine. It won't work for North Korea because there's no social media exploitation. It won't work for MS-13, which doesn't use online radicalization. Its recruitment and radicalization is through normal networks, person to person. So in some cases, you can examine issues through Facebook and other social media sites, and then other cases it's useless. So I just want to make sure that's relevant. You're aware of that. So review of week 3. Again, 2 case studies: Pearl Harbor and the Yom Kippur War, strategic surprise, and we discussed in these case studies both the traditional, the reformist, and the contrarian school for what causes surprise. The traditionalist is that there's far too much information out there, and it's the separating the wheat from the chaff, or connecting the dots, with whatever cliche you want to use there. That's a traditionalist, is that there's too much information and analysts can't sort through it. And you see the arguments in Pearl Harbor. There was so much indicators and warnings, so much information that they couldn't tell which was important and which wasn't. That's the traditional school. The reformist school argues that the information was there, but it wasn't, the organization of the intelligence apparatus wasn't put in a way that allowed the military commanders to get access to information. For example, information was collected at the national level by the Army G2 and the Navy N2 that was collected in Washington. But because of the bureaucracies and because the boxes and because people didn't report to the certain people, that information was not disseminated down to the people that could actually action it. You'll see that in the 9/11 case study, where information was collected that would have been very relevant to breaking up the 9/11 plot, but it was collected at bureaucracies in D.C. in highly classified compartments. Then it never got disseminated to people that could actually action it, that could make decisions that would have broken up the 9/11 plot. That is another school of intelligence failure. And then you have the contrarian school, which says it's not necessarily the analysts, it's not necessarily the policymakers, it's the collection assets. Lack of collection assets or lack of competency and effectiveness at collecting information is the cause of intelligence failure. And you saw this in my lecture where there was 6 aircraft carriers, the most important strategic asset in Japan, and we didn't have a location on them until Pearl Harbor happened. That is due to a lack of collection competence and assets that can actually affect change. So those are kind of the three issues that Dahl brings up. You have the Dahl thesis that tactical intelligence, or the Dahl thesis is that intelligence has to be tactical and close-hold enough or specific enough that it's relevant to policymakers. You can't just say that Japan's going to attack us somewhere, and that's meaningless. But the intelligence is receptive if you said something like Japan's going to attack in this day, this time, and therefore you can plan against it. And therefore the policymakers will pique their interest and they will make decisions based on that intelligence. That's fine, and Dahl is a very good writer. That's why I assigned his books, and I think his theses are correct. But I would just argue that very rarely in the real world do you get that type of specificity in intelligence. No one, and for those of you who deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, very rarely do you get the one source or one information that says there's going to be an IED attacking this convoy at this location, at this time, in this exact grid coordinate. That is not how it usually works. And very rarely, the 9/11 hijackers, you're not going to get the information that says, these 19 people will be on these 4 flights that take off at this time, and they're going to target this. That's not really what usually happens. Intelligence is a mosaic of information to drive risk reduction measures. And that's a key point, and that brings me up to the final one. I call it the Sharma School. It's not really called the Sharma School. I'm just kind of hypothesizing, is that you have to have, and what it essentially is you have to have enough intelligence to drive, and it has to be reasonable information to drive risk mitigation measures. Let's look at the Pearl Harbor example. I believe that there was very limited things that could have been done that would have mitigated Pearl Harbor. And I believe there was enough information to do that. You could increase patrols, you can cancel Sunday leaves, you can increase manning level on the guns, you could do all sorts of things that are relatively easy in the long scheme of things. That's the Sharma School. You do those things, there's no Pearl Harbor. Very simple. You've mitigated the damage considerably. We'll look at the 9/11 example. But in the 9/11 example, there was no intelligence that said Al-Qaeda was going to attack on September 11th and these planes, etc. But I believe there was enough information that Al-Qaeda was going to use a commercial aircraft as a Tomahawk missile. There was enough of a threat that you could have done basic mitigation circumstances. You could put a drink cart in front of the cockpit on every plane, as you see now if you ever fly. That would make sure there's no 9/11. Very simple. You could reinforce 20% of cockpit doors. There's no 9/11. You could put federal air marshals on planes. Those are relatively cheap and easy things you can do that would have made sure a 9/11 would not have happened. So again, it's intelligence implementing risk mitigation measures that would make sure there's no catastrophic risk. That is essentially what I call it the Sharma School. That's not really, it's been around for a while, but that's what I want you to think about as you're going through the next week's case studies and future surprise attacks, whether it's it's a cyber attack, whether it's Russian interference in our election, what have you, what information is out there that can drive very, very reasonable risk mitigation measures. So then, that goes into the next case study, Yom Kippur War. Again, the failures, over-reliance on humid, the single source, addiction to preconceived notions. We talked about the concept in detail in the Riddell reading. And then the lack of a net intelligence assessment. What the Israelis were surprised at was they didn't calculate. They thought about aircraft to aircraft, tank to tank. That was their analysis, and we can beat them because we have more tanks and we have a much more better air force. Their net assessment didn't account for anti-tank missile to tank or surface-to-air missile to airplane. They didn't look at these asymmetric inequities until it was too late, and that was one of the big surprises of the Yom Kippur War. So, with that being said, I thank you for your. I look forward to week. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me back up. Preview of week 4. So first, there is a lot of work in week 4. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It is actually a pretty significant work, and I'll prep you for the paper the following week. Both Iraq WMD and 9/11 case study. So Iraq WMD, you have the Rachel Maddow documentary. Again, Rachel Maddow is a liberal commentator, so take what she says with a grain of salt. But I think the documentary does encapsulate exactly what went wrong with Iraq and the WMD, or failure to find WMD in Iraq. You have the 60 Minutes curveball, and then you have the committee report, the Senate Subcommittee report on Iraq WMD. The committee report's 200 pages. Do not read 200 pages. Focus on the blue boxes, and you'll see that in the report. So, as you go through the report, read the blue boxes, or as you scroll through the internet or scroll through the report on PDF, read the blue boxes. If there's something that piques your curiosity, go in a little bit more depth on those reports or on that analysis. But all I want you to do is hit the high points for that report. And then you have the Sharma lectures on Iraq WMD. 9/11, again, you have the documentary, National Geographic, and the Nova NSA, great documentaries. You have the Dahl reading, and then the one chapter in the 9/11 Commission, and then you have the lectures. And the best way to look at this is do the Iraq WMD, do the readings, lecture, discussion board, then do the 9/11 readings, lecture, discussion board. That's the best way I can caveat it. So if there's questions or issues, let me know. And again, I look forward to the discussion boards this week.